that's something that's really uplifting and empowering for people to know. Let's see. Yes. Okay, now we're in business. And so I wanted to open up with that ayah, and then I wanted to kind of reach out to the audience, and I wanted to ask everyone, this is going to be a little interesting, but I want everyone to take a really deep breath, the deepest breath you've taken all day. So, right now. And I want you to notice if there's any tension in your body. I want you to notice if your jaw is tense, if your neck and shoulders have any tension. I want you to think about how you felt this morning when you woke up. And I think that I ask this because I believe that health is holistic. I believe that, as I'll talk later about when it comes to mental health and resources, I do believe that there is a time and place for medicine and psychiatry. I also believe in the power of, through our everyday lives, building in small self-care practices. And I think that having an awareness of your body is one of those things that can help us cope with anxiety, stress, and other issues that come about through day-to-day life. And then I wanted to ask the audience, what is mental health to you? When you hear that phrase, what do you think of? So anyone that has any thoughts on that, feel free to share. Yes. Walaikum assalam. Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily so easy to cope with either. And your empathy for other people, and there also the knowledge that regardless of how people look on the outside, you never know what's going on in the inside, that you have to have empathy for everyone. Yes. You know your limitations, you know yourself,
Anyone else? Yes.
Mental health, to me, it's mental stability. Being able to have control and of your emotions and be stable to continue to be responsible, productive citizen in society.
And some of you all kind of mentioned this in your responses, but I also wanted to ask, what does mental wellness look like in someone's life or in your life? How do you identify being in a state of mental wellness versus being in a state where you may need to seek outward help? Anyone have any ideas on that? Yes. Walaikum assalam.
To work and adapt to different social situations, and ability to be able to be productive under pressure, and at the same time, like Sister Darlene was saying, knowing your limitations and being able to communicate that with someone or a group of people in a way that is effective and still be able to be productive in that environment.
Yes. Walaikum assalam.
To me, mental wellness or mental health is when everything is clicking to the point where your brain is receiving impulses. Everything is firing the nervous system, and when that goes awry, that becomes mental illness. So if you have the chemistry in your brain is working correctly, then that is mental wellness.
Yeah.
But when it stops, be it to environmental stresses or genetic stresses, then that becomes mental health.
Yeah. I really appreciate all of your comments, and especially the comment about brain chemistry, because I think that's something that in communities of faith sometimes gets lost. I think sometimes we get lost when we interact with someone that may have a mental health disorder, and understanding that the reactions that they're having, their inability to work, or sometimes if you're talking about depression, there are people who can't get out of bed. And it's not for any physical reason that they can't get out of bed, but it's also when we're talking about an illness of the brain. So we see these behaviors and we know that they're irrational, or if we're experiencing something like maybe an anxiety attack, we may, after the fact, realize that the thing that we were anxious about wasn't necessarily to the proportion that we felt at the time, but that is valid because that is an illness in the brain, and to understand the importance of that, but also understanding that mental wellness affects everyone. It's not something that you need to be diagnosed in order to seek help for, or in order to look for guidance about. So I was just going to talk a little bit about my story. So as some of you may know, about a year and a half ago, I got hit by a car. And so aside from physical injuries, there were a lot of things that started happening that I realized were not necessarily normal, or they weren't my normal reactions to stress or anxiety. And so I was trying to figure out if it was just something that was going to pass. I was like, okay, well, yes, I should be angry, I should be anxious, like all of these feelings I know are valid, but I didn't really honor myself in addressing them in the way that I did later on. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what poor mental health looks like, because it's both individual and it's universal. Suffering is not something that's individual. It's not something that only one person feels, even though it can feel like that at the time if you are that person. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about personally myself. So one thing that happened that had never happened to me before was I had an anxiety attack. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about anxiety, we're thinking of it in the context of day-to-day. So we're thinking of, I have this project due at work. It's huge, it requires a lot of moving parts, it's stressful. I also have my day-to-day interactions that I'm still maintaining with family or friends. But when I had an anxiety attack, I didn't know what was happening. So I was kind of like, I have this overwhelming sense of dread in this moment for no particular reason, but I just have this overwhelming sense of dread, and my hands are shaking and my heart is racing, and there's no real reason for it to be happening. And so I kind of did something that, looking back on it, I kind of find it a bit funny, but I was cooking at the time, so I just kept cooking. And I was like chopping vegetables, and I have a 7-inch like chef's knife in my hand, and I'm like, yeah, my hands are shaking and I feel like I'm going to pass out. I'm just going to keep going because I don't really know what else to do with myself right now, so I'm just going to keep going. My mom told me to go sit down, which was probably for the best. But I did actually have a counselor at the time, and I talked to him about it after the fact, and he was like, well, what you did was a coping mechanism, and it wasn't necessarily wrong. And I think that that's a part of like intuition and knowing yourself and being aware of when something's off and doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. He said, next time, because you had a knife in your hand, I'd probably recommend not doing that. But one thing that you can do is, if you're feeling very, very overwhelmed or you're feeling very panicky, he was like, I kind of advise you to go get in the shower fully cold, like full blast at like the coldest temperature. You can still be standing in your clothes. You have to do something extremely weird to break yourself from that moment. And so that was interesting to me, because I was like, I felt like there should be an exact method for the way that I should handle it. I felt like I should just identify it, I should know it, I should lay down, or I should have like a journal and I should be able to write it out. There was going to be an exact process for the way I should walk myself through that. And that's not exactly what mental health awareness and taking care of yourself, self-care habits, that's not actually what they are. And how I think we have this cookie cutter idea of what happens, particularly when it comes to therapy. I think there's this idea of you sit on the couch and someone talks to you very soothingly and they kind of walk you through all of your issues, and in 45 minutes you're healed and you get to walk out and you'll be all better again. That's not exactly how my journey went. One thing that I experienced that was very interesting, and I think it's important to talk about in communities of color, is traumatic memories, PTSD, flashbacks, things like that. So one of the reasons that I bring that up is because a lot of the time, I think in the African American community in particular, our moments of trauma are kind of downgraded, or they're disregarded because we need to continue on. Particularly, we talked about a couple of times in some other taleems about the stereotype of a strong black woman, and there's a stereotype of being a strong black man. And the fact that boys don't cry, or if you are the single mother in a household, that you still have to take care of your children. I think in our society, there's not a lot of room given for being in a moment of weakness, particularly when it comes to mental health, because those are invisible scars. And so when you're in communities that are affected by trauma, be that because we are Muslim and there's a lot of like anti-Muslim rhetoric, there's also people who are victims of hate crimes, and hate crimes have been arising around in the United States. And then also thinking about domestic violence in households, or the traumatic things that can come about from being in an impoverished or underserved community. And I think that it's important for us to realize and to be there for each other when things like that happen. So for me, it kind of manifested in nightmares and in altered behavior that in theory is irrational. But one thing that my therapist told me that I wanted to share was that your brain, he told me when I was telling him, you know, I know it's irrational that like I don't want to take my dog for a walk because I got hit by a car in my neighborhood and I don't want to take her for a walk. I don't want her to get hit. I don't want anything to happen again. And he said, your brain doesn't care that you're okay. Your brain's job is to make sure that you're not put in danger again. So it's going to do whatever it thinks, be it irrational or not, to make sure that you're okay in the end. So you feeling nervous about going out and walking in your neighborhood again isn't actually irrational. It can be months, it can be years from now that you may feel that anxiety, but that's not actually irrational. It's your brain's job to make sure that you stay alive. And if you experience something traumatic, your brain chemistry is going to change. It's going to react differently to stimulus than it did pre-accident or pre-traumatic incident, depending on what it was and the nature of it. And so also understanding what triggers are. So does anyone know what like a psychological trigger is? Has anyone heard that word before? You want to give an example of one?
Trigger could be anything. It could be, an image of something that reminds you of a situation that happened. It could be a song that was playing at the time of the trauma. It could be, it could be something in nature that you see that reminds you of something that happened during a traumatic event.
Yeah. I read an article and it was a woman talking, I think it was titled something like Why I Don't Make Scrambled Eggs. And it was a woman who had experienced a rape and then in the morning made her rapist breakfast. And after that, she could never make scrambled eggs because that's what she cooked for him. And it was associated with her trauma. And so later on, it was, she had an interaction and she was making breakfast for, I think, and she was in a new relationship and he asked for scrambled eggs and she had a very visceral response to that request. And so the reason that I wanted to do a taleem or a talk about mental health is because I think things like that, being the new partner in that situation, that would be really disconcerting. That would be really uncomfortable situation to come across because you don't know why there's this like really angry response to asking for scrambled eggs, right? You don't know what that is. Or in some situation, like for me, I had a very odd reaction to, I remember the day I got hit, there were leaves on the sidewalk. And I remember like a month later, I was walking down one of the sidewalks at my university and they had the same trees and the leaves were on the ground. And I kind of was just walking or whatever and I looked at them and I kind of had like this, not really a flashback, but like a moment of being tense because I was like, And it wasn't completely conscious, but I noticed all of a sudden, like how I mentioned to you all at the beginning, I noticed my shoulders got really tense. I noticed my shoulders creeping up towards my ears. I noticed like this kind of twist in my stomach, and it wasn't at that point, you're like, okay, I shouldn't really be reacting to leaves. Like, it's like a very odd moment for you to experience, to be like, this like is not a conversation. I don't really come home to my parents and I'm like, leaves scared me today. That's a very strange way of having that discussion. And so I think that it's important for us to just be patient with one another and to be open and honest in our communications with the people that are close to us. And I think that's really difficult because a lot of the times when people are experiencing moments of difficulty, they tend to distance themselves from their family or from their friends. And I think that it's important to understand that if someone may be distancing themselves, that may be their coping mechanism. And they may not have experienced something, they may not have experienced how to healthily respond to a mental health issue. And I think that especially in communities that are underserved, that don't have as many resources, people shut down in order to make it. You know, there's this survival instinct that kind of takes over, and people may push all of their issues to the side in order to make it to the next day. Are we coming back? Maybe. And we're back. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to seek help. And so one thing that's really important is to recognize that the pain or the difficulty that you're going through is valid and that there are resources that are available to help, particularly in situations where people don't talk about therapy, people don't talk about like anything. A lot of the time, it's made to seem like patience means just silence. Having patience in a moment of difficulty means to just keep to yourself. You should say your 5 prayers. And if you're doing it correctly, you'll be fine. I saw on Facebook someone that I know posted something and they said, if you have depression, something along the lines of people who are faithful don't get depression. You know, people who are really truly close to their Lord or truly are believers don't experience depression because they go to their Bible or they go to their Quran and they'll be okay because all of your answers are there. But I think when you make a statement like that, you take mental health and you turn it into something that isn't affecting our community, and you isolate people more than they already are. And so I think it's important to think about how after Khadijah, may Allah be pleased with her, passed away, that time in the Prophet Muhammad's life was described as the time of sadness. And to think about what it means when he lost his infant son, or what it means when Job loses his family and has to be patient, and that doesn't necessarily mean silence. It doesn't mean the lack of suffering, but it means to know that in the eye of that storm that God is still with you. And I think that statements that we hear about the truly faithful don't experience moments of depression, or they don't have anxiety, or they won't be affected by any sort of mental health disorder, it removes people from the actual stories of the most faithful in the world and how they dealt with moments of suffering. And so one thing that I wanted to pull up, I'm going to pull it up on my phone, but if you all have a Quran with you, you can, yes. Yes, go ahead.
When I first moved to New York, I had trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and I suffered through it for a while, and then I sought out
Mm-hmm.
a psychiatrist, and I told him I needed to speak to
she said, well, this is what she told me. She said, well, you're not experiencing anything more than any other, experience. I said, what? And that was it. So, what I did. I had to turn to God to get me through it, because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten through that. So I think the ultimate is to turn to God, but you have to seek that help.
Yeah.
I've had other experiences where, I had, needed help, and the help wasn't there, but I had to ultimately turn to the Lord, because that was the only thing, my saving grace. So, I think we don't want to minimize people, because I know a person that's going through serious mental problems now. I don't minimize that person's they're going through, but I think eventually we could get a connection with the Lord.
And it was interesting. My counselor therapist, he wanted to try cognitive behavioral therapy with me, which essentially, if you look at its definition, it's taking your, it's the idea that your thoughts and your perceptions influence behavior. And so I kind of when I read the definition, I was like, I feel like that's something that's already been talked about in my community of faith. I feel like that's something that's already been touched on. I feel like I practice that to an extent. And so I wanted to read this ayat because I think that it's important. So it says, "When my servants ask thee concerning me, I am indeed close to them. I listen to the prayer of every supplicant when he call on me. Let them also with a will listen to my call and believe in me, that they may walk in the right way." And I think that again goes back to the idea that for someone who's of faith, who's suffering with something, knowing that Allah is ever present, and you feeling that comfort and having the confidence of knowing that, I think allows you to seek the resources that you need in order to be okay, in order to find help. And I think that that's really important, because sometimes situations like what you mentioned do come up, where you go to the Western, not even the Western idea, but you go to the traditional route of the comfy chair or couch and the therapist, and not everything that will be brought to the table may serve you, or you may not be served, particularly if we're talking about communities that are extremely underserved. Those resources aren't even always available to people. And I think that that's one of the reasons that, particularly with African Americans, that faith has been extremely strong. I think because for a long time our community was so extremely underserved and ignored that we didn't have those resources even available to us. And faith is the thing that we turn to, because it's always there. It's 24/7, 365. You don't have to go into any office in order to have access to that. And I think that that's really important to recognize and to uplift and to keep in mind when we're talking about mental health. I think that it's one of those things where both things work in tandem. I think it's important to really be faithful. And one of the things that I think about a lot is how dhikr and prayer is a meditation. You know how we kind of point to this idea of, well, one thing that you probably should not say to someone, but one thing that happens is it's like, oh, well, I did yoga when I was depressed and it was great. Totally fixed me. I was just on and off with my life. I'm the happiest I've ever been because I did yoga. And in the faith community, sometimes it's, well, did you pray today? If you pray and you do your prayer 5 times a day, you'll be good. And what happens to the person that's praying 5 times a day? What happens to the person that's doing yoga? What happens to the person that it's not working? That's the moment that I'm kind of, pointing to and talking about. And understanding that when I say that mental health is holistic, that yoga is helpful. But in my case, I was that person. I was that person that did yoga all the time. But when you get hit by a car, getting bendy is a little difficult. So my coping mechanism was taken from me. And that was a major source of anxiety. So what do you do in that moment? You reach out to friends and family, you read the Quran, you go to those moments in the life of the prophets that were difficult and you read them. And you really sit with the fact that that's real. And they didn't have to look for the approval of the person next to them for their suffering to be valid. They turned to Allah, because Allah is the one that is the validator of our pains and our sufferings and should be our ultimate refuge. So what not to say? Things like, I did yoga and I'm great now. I do have yoga listed as one of my resources, but you will never hear me say, I did yoga for PTSD on YouTube, and that is what fixed me. Because also I think the idea of looking for that fix is an unhealthy fixation to have. I think the idea that I will do this one thing and I will be okay, what happens when that fails? Or what happens when there's other parts that are not being addressed because of that? Yoga was great for grounding me in a moment. Dhikr is great for grounding me in a moment. But there's other moments that need to be addressed too. The way that I respond or interact, interpersonal relationships that I have, a lot of that was addressed in therapy, not so much in my acts of worship or in my yoga practice. And so it's not that I have a list of things not to say, but I think it's important to be compassionate, especially if someone's sharing with you a moment of difficulty or you suspect that someone's experiencing a mental health issue, and also to center your conversations with that person around what they need. I think that it's easy for me, if I have experienced a moment of, I've had issues with anxiety or panic attacks, if someone comes to me and they say I was having a panic attack, I still need to center the conversation around what they're experiencing and how I can support them. Me telling them, well, I did this one YouTube video and now every time I have a panic attack, I do that and I'm okay. That's a resource. But if that doesn't work for the person, it doesn't work for the person. And so I think it's important to really ask and be open to listening to what someone truly needs. If someone is not really being responsive to maybe saying that Dhikr really worked for me, it's really a good meditation for me, it calms me down. If they say, well, that didn't work for me, telling them that they're not faithful enough is not going to get them to a place of wellness where they feel more open to that sooner, that practice. And so I think that that's something to be aware of. And so I have a couple of mental health resources up on the screen. I listened to Dr. Halim Naeem. He has a couple of YouTube videos where he speaks about mental health awareness in the African American Muslim community. And he also speaks around the country at different events. And then the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding has a mental health toolkit for Muslim Americans that's on their website that's really helpful, and also talks about resources for Muslim youth that may be experiencing mental health concerns. And then the Journal of Muslim Mental Health has a lot of peer-reviewed articles about the state of mental wellness in the Muslim American community. And I think that that's something, if you're interested in looking at it from an academic approach, is something that would be an interesting read for some people. And the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, they have a Facebook page, and they also, I believe, probably have an Instagram or a Twitter. I don't really know what that that username is for. It was on their Facebook page, but they have a lot of resources as well. Go ahead. Sure.
I have a
Yeah.
question. So when you were talking about traumatic events, whether we talk about the shooting in New Zealand and the impact of people, or even the impact of
the shooting of black boys, men, women, etc. What would be your suggestion to maybe assist young African American boys, teens, girls, young women around, the triggers or traumas that maybe they don't even recognize?
I think that it's important to make space for those conversations to happen. I think that while us having this talk right here is really an amazing opportunity, I also think it's important to build these conversations into the other programs that we may have or other discussions that we have. Sometimes, especially in young people, their reactions to trauma are often behavioral issues. And I think that what ends up happening is we come down with an iron fist on the child that may be acting out without realizing that that's a response to trauma. And it's important to make space for younger people to feel comfortable coming and talking to their parents and to other members of the community about things that may be going on in their life. I think that that's one way that we can create a space that's more welcoming and more able to handle some of the results of trauma that we see in young people and in our communities. Yes.
Also now in the healthcare profession, there is an undercurrent to put mental health and medical health in the same, in the same space, such that when a medical doctor realizes that it's something other than going on with this particular person, they can not just say, well, don't make your appointment, they can send you next door. Because lots of times things happen and we don't notice. And because of that, I guess, false shield we put up, we don't see it. So what I'm saying is that lately there's so many people we've heard in the news who committed suicide because of mental health, and I still believe that Dr. John Nash committed suicide because he was in a car wreck. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I guarantee you, I was thinking just to me personally, I was saying that when President Obama gave him the Medal of Physics, he's a physics scientist. When I was noticing his appearance and his how he was looking, and I was thinking to myself, he is under so much stress and so much his condition, his mental illness, that he is, to me, he just looked like he wasn't well enough to even be on the stage with President Obama. He was just there. So, long story short, and then I heard later that he was killed in a car accident, and I thought, I bet anything he probably drove that car off the cliff, because it's like there's so many people around us that have mental issues, and we don't notice it. But when my daughter became ill, I began to notice homeless people, the things that they were doing. I'm like, these people are mentally ill. They are out on the street because they don't want to take the medicine. They don't want to stay at home. They don't want to be confined. A lot of them were the Vietnam veterans, and a lot of them just people. In President Reagan's era, he just emptied the mental institution they out on the streets, for whatever reason. But if you notice that a lot of homeless people, you see them talking to themselves, you see them answering people, you see them doing different things on the street. So these people are mentally ill. And then with all the pressures, and then the genetic factors that are incorporated into that, you have a lot of people who have serious problems. Most of the time, people who are mentally ill will commit or do commit suicide because the illness is so powerful. So you really do have to combine physical health, wellness, and mental wellness, and mental health and then therapy, it has to all work together.
Yeah.
And a lot of, in our society, it doesn't work together. You get a lot of pushback from people when they find out that, oh, this person is mentally ill. Because we don't want to think of illness above, anywhere, I guess, above the neck, you know, because, you know, but see, the thing is that the way I look at religion is that Allah put these people in places to help you. So you don't just, you know, you pray and you ask Allah for guidance, but He put people in places to help you with different things that you, professional people help you. So you need to seek their help, you know. So that's kind of the way I look at it, because it is something that's real. You know, it's real. And then I researched in the history of my family. I saw evidence in my sister's genetic makeup. There were people that were diagnosed that didn't have a diagnosis, and you know, and even I was like, and then recently, my mother's oldest sister, you know, she's diagnosed, and I'm like, wow, I didn't know this, you know. So I'm just saying that a lot of it could be genetics, and then brought on by the stresses of society and the stresses of difficulty in school or whatever, you know, and you got a full-blown case of no illness.
And there was, I'm going to continue.
I was just saying, in nursing and all the years I was nursing, I realized that a lot of people that had a lot of intelligence had mental problems, but they weren't, you know, they were functionable and they could still function. But if you talk with them long enough or towards death and dying, you realize they had some mental issues as well. But also it's the way they categorize it into society and make it so, because I saw a lot of geniuses with some mental illness problems. And do a lot of things. And a lot of people who have mental illness are very intelligent. And then there's other on other levels that don't have much intelligence. But a lot of them have done a lot of beautiful things in their life and have reached goals, professors with all kind of degrees. And I take care of people like that. But they go off the edge.
Well, I think we have this idea that, like sometimes when people hear mental illness, they immediately jump to stereotypes of someone maybe with bipolar, or they jump to stereotypes of someone with schizophrenia. And a lot of the things that we see in like the homeless population or things that we see in underserved communities are people who have not been included within that system. And I think I appreciate Sister Yehuda bringing up the I guess the abolition of like mental hospitals for the most part. There's a book, it's called, I have to look it up. I will look it up and let you all know, but it was talking about the criminalization of mental health in America. And it talked about the way that a lot of people who would have been put in asylums previously, and asylums were not a healthy way of handling mental health at all. But people who previously would have been put in asylums, once they were released, were put into the criminal justice kind of system. And then particularly if they were people who were of color, the ways that the criminal justice system absolutely has not given them any recourse or help for mental health, and also people being released from the prison system and not having access to their meds anymore. And what happens to people when they're put in those sort of situations. And so I think it's important. There's a lot of mental health reform that needs to happen in the United States, but I do think that at least as communities of faith, I think that being there for people that come through our doors and being there for our friends and family, and letting them know not only the kind of faith-based approach, I think we can also let them know that there are those resources, like the resources that I mentioned. I did put up the National Suicide Hotline number, and also something that I noticed on Google as I was Googling all of this stuff. Google has started putting different resources at the top if you Google certain things. So I had a friend who attempted suicide a few months ago, and I was like Googling how to be a good friend to someone in that sort of situation, because I'm like, I've never been presented with this issue before, and I want to be as compassionate as possible when I'm talking to him. and at the top of it, it was like the National Suicide Hotline. It had, are you experiencing any sort of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts? Here are resources. And I think that it's important for our communities to also know those resources and to know that those are available to people. And that's why I put some of the Muslim American organizations and activists on here, because they will better understand some of those traumas that we face. Talking to my white male therapist about a couple of things was, it was more of a teaching experience than it was a healing one for me in certain moments. And I think that that's why it's so important for us to support African American and Muslim American organizations and psychologists and psychiatrists, because they are better equipped to handle certain conversations. And particularly as communities who are marginalized, I think that you don't always want to be teaching, especially in a moment like that. So I think that knowing that those resources are available is really important. Yes?
I was going to say, what suggestions do you have, for instance, to make sure that our communities can reach those resources easily? Because in the, not just our community, but in the wider Muslim community, as communities of color, a lot of people, a lot of smaller communities have problems with PTSD, having been subjected to torture, having been subjected to being a refugee, having been subjected to all kinds of things. And I know, like, as for me, as an individual, you know, having grown up in an area where there was war, that sort of thing affects you really for the rest of your life. So those kinds of resources are available, but they also have to be resources that are targeted towards what your particular issue would be, and to have those resources available. And I know from having come into contact with people that they're not aware of the resources, they don't know where to go, and they end up in places where they shouldn't be. You know, they end up in places where people say, oh, this person has X, Y, or Z. And that is not the case at all.
Yeah.
You know, when they are really reacting to something that has happened that is unusual to this general population, but it's not something that is like unusual in the population that they came from. So we have to make those more, this kind of resource more available. What suggestions do you have to make it more available to people?
That's a difficult one. All of the resources that I listed today are, like the journals peer-reviewed, all of those resources. The difficulty is I think that social media is our best option, and that's difficult for certain populations because they may not be on social media, they may not. I think one of the reasons that I was exposed to a few of these resources was simply out of the fact that the people that I'm friends with on Facebook were sharing those resources or were talking about certain things. Like I have a friend who's doing her PhD on sexual violence and PTSD and kind of what, how that affects the brain. But because I have access to that person, I was seeing resources, you know? And so the one thing that I would suggest is sharing those things. I know that after the New Zealand shooting, I did see people sharing resources for Muslim mental health, and I think that we underestimate the power of the share button. I think we underestimate what that can do. But when you see that online and you share it, also mention it to people in the community. That's something that could get mentioned after a Friday prayer. It could, like if there's a webinar, I know there were like several webinars about like Muslim mental health that happened right after the New Zealand shooting, and making that resource available, be it a flyer, be it an announcement, be it what have you. I think that that's really important, because if you see it, that's great, and that's great for your 200 friends or followers that you may have. But what about the person in the masjid that may not necessarily be super connected on the internet? And so I think that bringing those resources into the community itself is also like really important and something worth mentioning. Yes.
In addition to what you have up here, so
Okay.
They have their website is www.jwgtherapy.com. And again, they're on Instagram. And another thing, Black American Muslim Conference is coming up in April.
Okay.
So they're going to be talking about things that are pertinent to African
Yeah.
American Muslim. And in Jackson Wellness Group, they're African American Muslim psychologists.
Can you text that to me? Because I'm probably going to send these resources to Brother Halal.
I would say
And yeah.
also too,
I'm sorry.
but I was going to say that also locally, I belong to NAMI, which is the National Association of Mental Illness, and they were very helpful. I attended classes for about 4 or 5 months, and I still am kind of like affiliated. They were very helpful in bringing on presenters to help us, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, attorneys, and giving us the information that we need to work through the system in order to help our be a better provider for the be a better care provider for our sick, ill person or ill patient. So that was a group that kind of help you maneuver through, and it's free, and they help you maneuver through the system because there is a lot of stereotyping and there is a lot of pushback when you're talking about medical resources. So, and then they have programs through, at that time, through MedLink. That was a good program to help you maneuver the system. And there was a black psychiatrist from Harvard that he was like an acupuncturist. He got a lot of pushback, so he eventually moved to Florida. But there are people, that can give you other leads too. So locally, that may be something you can do. Reach out. And also, there's a psychiatrist who believes that you can retrain the brain. Like you once thought that you were born with the amount of cells that you were going to have for life, but you can retrain the brain. So there's a lot of help in done research being done in how to retrain the brain so you can actually be productive.
Yeah, and that cognitive behavioral therapy, if you look at it, that's kind of that same idea of identifying irrational behaviors or identifying the things that are inhibiting you from leading the life that is most productive and mentally well, and kind of reworking that. And a resource I neglected to mention, for any college students that you may know, typically they have a counseling services department, and those resources are free. So that's something to kind of bring up with any college students that you may know. They may hear of it in passing at like orientation or something, but it's a resource that's really underused. I know for a fact at UNCC it's very underused, and so I think that that's something also to kind of be aware of and let people know is available to them. Yes.
In the same way that we have information on who to contact or what resources are available for domestic violence, for instance, in places like bathrooms and so forth, that is an area that is private. Nobody needs to know that you know this resource. You can take a picture and put it in your phone, you can write it down. To have that kind of a flyer for mental health resources so that you can write down whatever you need and then get into contact with them later. But just so that it's available, because so many people just have no idea. They don't know where to go, and they walk around with whatever it is that they're suffering.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that in May 25th, I think it's going to be at the Masjid. We're going to have a mental health seminar. It's a luncheon, I think. Colonel Cunningham represents so if anybody wants more information on that, something else is coming up. I think it's very, because in our service class, we have been talking about the same issue and trying to get, because we do have, for whatever reason, we have things holding noticed that we all had mental illness to some degree. And so, we had a conversation in our service class, and we wanted to just talk about what it is that's inhibiting members from coming together. Because to me, that is a mental health issue.
Yeah.
To some degree.
And I think you said this earlier, but I think as we talk more about it and we reduce the stigma around reaching out for help, and that you're no less of a Muslim because you go to a counselor or a psychiatrist or what have you, particularly for African American Muslim men, that, that it's not a weakness to seek help. We don't want to wait until it's too late. And then they're like totally spirals out of control. I know that with postpartum depression, I never knew anything about it until I was in the seat of it. And I have plenty of people around me who love me, but nobody said, hey, after you have these babies, it may be all overwhelming, and it may be to the point where you may need X, Y, and Z resources. So I think that as we continue to talk about it, I think it will be helpful. One other resource that, I know you, so I can get it to you, but Imam Salim that does the Mali conference, his daughter-in-law lives here, and she's a counselor in Charlotte. And so I will share that with Naila so she can
Share that
information as well. The name of her counseling service is called Kaleidoscope Counseling. She's located, I think, in Uptown Charlotte off of 8th Street.
Yes.
Will you do this again?
Sure.
So that,
Sure, I will.
so that more people, because
Yeah.
for that same reason, people need to get away from the idea that there's some sort of stigma with mental. It's just like any other part of your body.
Yeah.
If something is not right, you go and get help, you go get it fixed, or at least get some sort of help so that it's better.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You mentioned this. We had one time we did foster care.
Mm-hmm.
We had foster children. Of course, they had to go to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, I was getting more benefit from the therapy.
I think people underestimate how helpful it is to just kind of work through some things with a neutral party. I think that that was the most beneficial thing, because I had the blessing or the curse of already knowing kind of what my triggers were, and I kind of already knew that the response that I was doing was not necessarily the most beneficial to getting it resolved, right? So I was like, yeah, I know that this is probably irrational. I also know that my reaction to stress, like this anger I'm feeling, this emotions that I'm feeling, I know the reason for it, I know. But that's where my knowledge kind of ended. It was like, yes, I have this awareness of myself. Awareness only goes so far if you don't actually have the toolbox to kind of fix that. And I think that that's what having access to mental health practitioners and others who may have experienced something similar to what you're going through, I think that's where that comes in handy, being able to kind of work through it, or hearing someone say, well, try this thing and try these other options. And if one of them fails, that doesn't make you a failure, and it also doesn't mean that what you're going through is hopeless. There are other things that we can turn to. And so I think that that's why it's so important to kind of get these resources out to the community. Yes, Sister Ashley. Walaikum salam.
I was wondering, since mental health is it's an individual, family, community, world issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I really am so grateful that you're here to share with us today. And I'm looking very forward to, and I know all of us are to sharing more information so that the more of us hear it. And I'm grateful that Brother Clarence is here, but I'm trying to think of how we get the room filled with not only sisters but brothers too, to get us all out. And because sometimes when you share something with someone else, you may not have the ability to really sort of include that person and advise that person of what you got
and in a way that is going to cause them to say, oh, you know, when is she coming back? I want to be a part of it too. So I'm just saying, you know, I'll totally get the brothers on the other side. And sometimes too, I think we don't realize that usually growing up, when we have children that for whatever reason are misbehaving, and we just, oh, this child needs to be, you know, disciplined, that is a problem. We need to seek help at the very young age of 2, 3, and 4. Because I see now, when I go to work, I see parents bringing their children into the behavior health, they call it behavior health child area. And you see these little tiny people coming in, you're like, okay, but and it makes sense because they go to school, things happen, you know, in the school, things happen in the home that you don't think affect the child. And then the child grows up and they have issues and you see it later when like, and I taught school for a minute or two, and I'm sitting watching the news and they're my student up there. I'm like, no, what are you doing up there? You know, I'm like, you know, I'm seeing my students, you know, being sent to prison. I'm like, huh? You know, so and especially the African American children, our whole community, we have problems. We have deep-seated problems that we need to fix. Because if you see it in the prisons. That's what we're seeing it most of. And we as a people and as a race, and especially our men, gotta stop thinking that this is taboo. You know, this is not taboo, this is for real. And we gotta figure out a way to help our children, because if we don't, they all gonna be in the prison system. And that's what's happening. The people you see in the prison system, the people you see doing bad things or doing things that they shouldn't be doing, it has to do with mental health. It definitely has to do with mental health.
So speaking to what Sister Essie asked about how to kind of fill the room, it wasn't even announced, I think, that I was doing this Talim. So I think that this is just indicative of just a general trend. And that's a complicated discussion on how to fix that. But I would say, as far as making what I talked about more available for the people that may not have come in the room, what I mentioned about like sharing, and I think that like just having access to being able to learn about mental health is really important, because people can do that kind of on their own time. They can seek those resources in a way that's most comfortable to them. Some people aren't always comfortable sitting in here. I asked you all to be in a pretty vulnerable space when discussing this, and speaking about maybe personal experiences that you all have had. And that's like a very vulnerable spot to be in. Me being up here is a very vulnerable spot. And so I think that not everyone is always comfortable doing that, but I think that building this discussion into more conversations is important, because I think that normalizes it, and I think that that makes people feel more comfortable to acknowledge that something might be happening, and knowing that it's not a weakness to go and try to find a way to help yourself. And what you said about youth and experiencing traumas or anything that results in kind of like a mental health issue. I was at work and there was a situation where a student was misbehaving, and they got, I tried to correct them, and it was a little African American boy, and the teacher kind of responded, and she was like, oh, he's a special behavior student, and kind of wrote him off. And it frustrated me, because not only, regardless of mental health, because I don't know him well enough to say anything on that, but we do know that a lot of the behavioral issues is a reaction to things that might be happening in the home. It's a reaction to the way children have learned to respond to their environment. And so writing anyone off isn't productive. You know, regardless of mental health, that student has now learned that that behavior is acceptable, because he's invisible. Because you've effectively made him invisible. You said, we're just going to ignore what he's doing. We're just going to ignore it and allow him to continue to think that that response is natural and healthy to the issue that he's experiencing or the frustration that he's having. And frustration and stress and anxiety, those things compound into mental health issues a lot of the time. And so I think it's important for us to, with young people and with just other people in our lives, to not write anyone off by their behavior immediately, because it's not productive. You're not going to get anything out of it. And that person is now learning that either they're invisible or what they're doing is acceptable, or that nobody cares. And so why should I care about my own mental health? Why should I care that I don't feel good when I'm reacting this way? It doesn't feel good to be angry all the time, but people learn that that's just the way that they're supposed to react to things because there's no other option being given to them. And so I think that that's something important to consider. Yes.
I wanted to say that ago, and we had some children that were putting them on Ritalin, a lot of children were on Ritalin, and the doctors were writing a lot of them off to some negative things about that. And this one Caucasian said that one thing that our people, young people, need to do is have your children at their dinner having socialization skills. You know, with things, he said, because they'll put your child in a category where they won't put mine in there. Because we're teaching them the skills and we know that's this part and we work through it. And I said, Dad, that is true. You know, but she said, we do this for our children. Start them off very little, 2 years old, whatever. She said, but the African American children don't get that. And then they come in here and they act out, and then you put them in a category, and they were putting a lot of children on Ritalin.
And a lot of them do the diet too.
Yes.
One program that's happening at West Charlotte that I thought was really interesting is they've been doing a yoga program and a meditation program at school. And also there have been both prisons and schools that have been incorporating things like yoga or meditation classes instead of doing ISS, or instead of doing suspensions. In-school suspensions is what ISS stands for. Instead of doing kind of like a detention or putting a lot of like penalties, and you're denying that student of education. If we're talking students, you're going to deny a student of education, and on top of it, you're not giving them a coping mechanism to what they may be going through. And so I think that that was something that was really interesting. And I did, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint and a couple of other things via email, but one thing that I thought was helpful, I put Yoga with Adrienne, who I just tout her praises all the time, but she has several videos that I've done, and the reason that I point to yoga and I point to, like, I do also talk about diet and the importance of that, but she has a couple of videos like Yoga for Depression. It's like 15 minutes long. The thing is, 15 minutes is not going to cure you. But what it does do is help ground someone in a moment, or help someone relieve the physical symptoms of what they're going through. Her Yoga for Anxiety videos, a lot of people, I think also men, get very off-put by the idea. They think they're going to sit in a room and they're going to chant, and they're going to have to say super still, or the idea of meditation is that nothing can ever pass through your brain, no other thoughts. You're supposed to envision a tree, and you're supposed to just sit there for 30 minutes, and you're just supposed to envision the tree and be calm, and that doesn't work for a lot of people, particularly in the environment that we have right now, where everyone's constantly stressed and constantly going. I like that some of her anxiety videos are fast-paced, because it's like, okay, I'm going to let you get out that energy in a healthy manner. And that can be anything. Like for me, I like running sometimes. Well, I don't like running. Running is helpful for my anxiety. It is not an enjoyable experience for me. But I think that it's important to find the things that work for you. And I think that a lot of the time people are either written off, or there's such a kind of square box of the way that mental health works. Like a lot of people think if I admit that I have this mental health thing, I'm going to get put in a mental institution, or I'm going to have to sit on a couch and talk about my feelings and cry to a stranger. And that's a very uncomfortable proposition for a lot of people. But that's not necessarily the way that mental health needs to be addressed. It's not cookie cutter. I think both with mental health awareness and with feminism, we've seen this like very white Western view of the way that it's supposed to be handled. And I think that when it comes to mental health, it's this idea of you completely throw out any faith benefit. You kind of put your faith to the side because clearly that's not working for you. So we're going to put all of that to the side. And you're going to go and you're going to see this wonderful white lady named Jennifer, and she is going to guide you through some really hokey exercise, and then you're supposed to be better. If you're not better, we're going to put you on a pill, and then we're going to put you in a hospital. And that is kind of like the path that people see. And that's not necessarily the path that's going to work for a lot of people, or people don't want to kind of go into that. And that's a very uncomfortable thing. And so I think that knowing that there are other options, it's very difficult for people to find those if they're not put in a space where they can seek that. But I think continuing to have those conversations and stuff is important. Yes. Whoever was.
I just wanted to note that Ritalin, there are some children who
need it.
definitely need
Yeah.
to be on that. But if you look at other populations on other continents, not even countries, on other continents, where they actually make the drug with Ritalin, but they very seldom put the children on that. The amounts of children that are on that the percentage is minimal because they treat it in a different way. They go more to the holistic treatment. They look at the diet. They look at, the environment that the child is in, all of that, as well as the school environment. And they don't really put the kids on that. So when I hear all of these children on this, and when you have
give them a check for getting Ritalin, and that's
right,
how they
and
were doing it.
when you look at comparable populations, if you look at populations of color, for instance, in France, and populations of color anywhere else, and you have the same sort of behaviors because they experience racism, Islamophobia, all those things, they live in the worst sections and so on, and yet the children are not put on that. So it's something to look at really carefully and not jump on that bandwagon immediately.
Yeah, and
As I said, there are some children who do in fact need it, but not, it's not a wide brush.
And I think it's important to be your own health advocate. I talk about that. I've mentioned it a lot when I'm in conversation talking about not just mental health, but like actual physical health. It's really important because a lot of the time, there's actually a book that came out recently about how women in particular, their health is not taken seriously in when they're interacting with doctors. And you put stigma on mental health on top of that, or the lack of training about mental health for general practitioners, and kind of the unhealthy environment that's created for handling it in a way that's productive. And so for a lot of people, when it comes to taking medicine, being aware of what those side effects are, being aware of if it's not affecting you in a way that's beneficial, to go back to your doctor. And that's difficult when we're talking about access to resources and access to capital to even seek those resources. That becomes very difficult to talk about and find solutions to. But I do think it's important to, especially if we're talking about children and their mental health and taking medicine. I mean, mom knows best, and the guardian, being aware of how your child's being impacted, and taking other holistic measures, either in tandem with medication or before you get to that point, and being aware of what children in your space of influence are going through. I think that's really important, and I think that could help rectify kind of the overprescription of drugs, or the prescription of something that's not necessarily what the child is going through. A child may be hyperactive in class, and actually that may be a way of them dealing with a trauma at home. And so being aware of everything that's happening in that child's life, because if you jump to them being hyperactive and it's really a response to a trauma or domestic violence in the home, or an absent parent, I think that that's important to kind of look for. And I think a lot of the times it doesn't happen. And that's where you see the overprescription or the complete lack of a child getting any access, especially if we're talking in schools where a lot of people of color are written off and put in detention when they need to go to the school counselor, you know? And so I think that those are things that we can always kind of keep in mind.
And most psychologists have their own personality.
Yes.
And
Yes.
psychologist
Every psychologist has a psychologist, yeah. Yeah.
you to help others.
I was gonna,
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you, about experiences, not with, mental health per se, but also supporting someone going through, a depression or trauma or whatever. What, I think you alluded to, the best things to do, but what happens as a loved one if I'm trying to, contact a loved one and give them resources and they don't respond the way that I want them to or whatever? What can the person do? How describe that interaction? What can
So for me, I've mentioned this to you, but when my friend attempted suicide, after the fact, we didn't really talk about it. And I did the whole, I'm there for you, let me know if you want to talk about it. And he had actually kind of disappeared off the face of the earth he went missing, and that's how we found out that he was in the hospital. And so I reached out to him and I was like, I know that you're not feeling well right now, but feel free to reach out to me. When he reached out to me again, it was, hey, how's school? You good? Awesome. Okay. And then I was kind of like, shouldn't we be talking about what happened? This is great, the coffee table talk or the little chit chat's nice, but things happened. And I had to take a step back and kind of make sure I was meeting him where he could meet me, because a lot of the time our response is, I want to help you, I want to help you, I want to help you. And you're not responding in the way that I'm feeling like this conversation should go. When you have this conversation in your head of how this is going to go, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to tell you that I'm there for you. I'm going to give you this links to the internet or the YouTube video. I've got you. I've got a name of a psychologist you can see. And then the person just wants to talk about the day-to-day or just wants to talk about how you're doing. And taking a moment to really meet that person where they can meet you. I think that's really important. When you talk about someone who may have depression, they can't always respond to you in the way that you would want. They may be dismissive, they may be absent, they may not answer all of those, texts or phone calls that you're giving them and reaching out and trying to be there for them. I think that asking, what do you need, is really important, but also either as a caretaker or as someone who is a family member or friend, I think it's really important to take care of yourself as well and to understand that a person is also responsible. That person that's going through something is also responsible for meeting you halfway. And so what you can do is kind of take care of yourself in the meantime. Let that person know that you're there for them. Let them know that you're willing to talk to them. Give them the resources. And then also know that sometimes that's stressful on you. If you live with someone who has depression, it's stressful when they can't help contribute to household chores, or it's stressful when you have a bad day and that person can't be your listening ear. That's extremely difficult to deal with. And so I think recognizing that you also need to take care of yourself is the way that you all can still maintain a healthy relationship through struggles, is knowing that I'm here for you, I'm reaching out to you, I'm letting you know that I'm here to help you, and then also self-care practices on your end. Because as someone kind of mentioned, everyone has a little bit of a mental health thing that they're going through. You also need to be addressing what's going on with you so that you're in the best space to deal with someone else when they come to you for help. And so for the situation with my friend, it was acknowledging that maybe right now he's not in a space where he wants to talk about it. He may be embarrassed at the fact that I know that it happened. And so understanding that, telling him that I'm there for them, and then continuing on being his friend. But now I check in a little bit more. Now I ask him how he's doing, and I really listen to the response that I get. You know, we live in 2 different countries. So where I would usually text him, now we're FaceTiming more so that I can see him when I ask him how he is. Or if you're usually doing the phone call with the person, actually going out and seeing them at Starbucks or seeing them when you see them in public and really asking and meaning it when you say, how are you? I think that kind of helps alleviate some of the tension that can happen when there's miscommunication. Yeah, anybody else? I've been talking so long. Yes.
I just wanted to mention, I remember when I was moving to Charlotte and my mother-in-law was going to be living with us, and I said to myself, knowing me, how is it going to deal with all of this? So, I don't know, Imam Ash-Shaheed in Winston-Salem, he did a lecture on the book, The Road Less Traveled, and somehow it fell into my hands, and I read it, and that helped me out so much. So, you know, Allah would always put things in your path to help you out.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone else have any comments or anything they want to say? Okay. Then I guess we will close out. I wanted to thank you all for coming and listening to my rambling. I appreciate it. And I guess we can close out without Fatiha. Do you want to come up and make any comments before we close out?
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. So I'm sure that you enjoyed it. I apologize. I was caught up into something else. We're trying to get ready for a long awaited conference that men have been planning. Your father will be getting some information from us, you know, and all praise is due to Allah. Also, I just want to mention this. There are some ayats in the Quran that deals with mental health. And I want to refer you to them. As well, let me say, there's a book. No, okay. Surah 10, verse 57. Surah 41, verse 44. Surah 17, verse 82. I think. Ma'am?
Can you repeat them again, maybe at the end or whatever?
Okay, let me go down. I'm taking this from an article that's written about the Quran and how it addresses, mental health. And that's for those of us who sometimes when we are reading the Quran, we have to know also that the Quran addresses that. Let me go back. I tell you what, I wish I had a board. I could give you the name. The article is called "Mental Health in the Holy Quran" by Dr. Morteza. That's Morteza Khorrami. That's Khorrami. Islamic Azad University. Islamic Azad University. And it has some of this I can't pronounce. GHAE. This is a dash GHAEM SHAR. Wait a minute. Let me do it again. GHAEMSHAR. Branch. And this was a paper that was presented in Toronto in 2010. Okay, it says that please do not, I'm quoting it anyway, please do not quote or reproduce without the consent of the author. You can read it, but don't reproduce.
You want to, I can scroll down. You wanted to hear a couple of the stories that you mentioned.
You already mentioned some sewers. I didn't hear it, but all praise to Allah.
What are the sewers that you had mentioned?
Surah 10, verse 57.
You mentioned it?
No. They want to know those. You want to read them off?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay. Surah 17, verse 82. Let's see if there are any more. We have Surah 3, verse 103, and Surah 8, verse 46.
46.
Mm-hmm. And there are some more that are in that article. I believe probably if you Google the name of the article and the author, it'll come up.
It'll come up.
Yeah.
Just put mental health in the Quran. It should come up.
Thank you.
All praise due to Allah. I know she does an excellent job. Very intellectual type of presentation. The same with her mother, Sister Arisa. They are twins. Did y'all know that? And her grandmother over there. Her grandmother is more like, I'm here, but she's kind of laid back. Have a like wonderful, beautiful family, and thank you very much. I'm trying to think of some things that are going on, but the only thing I can say at this moment, the brothers have a program coming up on June 21st to 23rd. It's going to be an excellent program. It's going to be in a little place near Blowing Rock. You know, it's going to be like 3 days, and well, actually 2 days, not quite 2 days. We'll go up there on Friday night, have a workshop, and then the next day we'll work all day. Make sure that your husband come. And we're also blessed to have the expertise of Sister Teresa, who's doing the Eventbrite and all that stuff. That's really good. You know, so if it was me, I'd do everything longhand. No, so we appreciate her help. Yes, ma'am.
Also, on May 25th, isn't there going to be a mental health here?
Oh yeah, May 25th. I'm sorry. There is another mental health thing here on the 25th, and that's by what's a representative Carla Cunningham. She's going to be here on the 25th of May. Write that down. You know. Wait, hold it. She told me she would rather do it after Ramadan. When I just told her, and we haven't talked about that day. Oh, alhamdulillah. That's good. Well, she would probably tell you about that, you know, because they would be here. But she wanted, after I told her doing that, when she wanted, we'll probably be in Ramadan. She said, well, I would love to just do it after Ramadan. I went to one of those sessions. A lot of clergy people are dealing with congregations and also dealing with themselves. You know, you can't help somebody unless you help yourself. You know, you got to be able to help yourself. You know, and when you're working with people, and I don't want to go back over your talk. I know you did it and they have some mental health problems, and you have to be able to separate your agenda from theirs, because if you don't do that, if you got the same problem, you get caught up in there. Yeah, that's right. So you have to know their issues as well, you know, and so. At least that's what they told us in clinical pastoral care. You know, so I don't know. We've tried it. I don't know if it works. So we thank Allah for you, and we love to see young people here. I see Sophia's in the audience. Yes, ma'am.
I had just a quick comment on Naila's comment when she was talking about training and how some of the professionals will separate the spiritual from the medical treatment. Would you say that best treatment would be a combination of the spirituality along with the medical treatment and along with individualized assessing.
Yes, that's kind of what I alluded to, I guess, when I said that it needs to be a holistic approach. There are psychologists and psychiatrists who do take a faith-based perspective, but that's not always available. And so I think letting people know that there is the resource of seeking psychiatric treatment or going to a psychologist or a counselor, and that there is also counseling with your local imam or your pastor, or also just knowing that there's things they can turn to the Quran as well, and pointing to those surahs and things that might bring ease to someone's heart, I think is also helpful. So I think that kind of balance, particularly like in the United States where we live in a very secular society, it's not always accessible to find someone who's trained in mental health who is also going to take a faith-based approach. So I think knowing that it's like having that toolbox. And sometimes you're not going to get a 3-in-1. You're going to get 3 individual things that can help you. And so I think that that's kind of what I would suggest.
All praise to the Lord. Yeah, the holistic approach is best because we're not, we were talking about that this morning, we're not spirit separate from mental, and our sensitivities and all that. When we say nafs, it's not the same thing as spirit. Spirit in Arabic is ruh. You hear the word air, ruh. When we talk about soul and intellect and all that stuff, when you say nafs, you're talking about the whole thing. And Allah says in the Quran, He created us from one nafs. So it's just talking about the total person internally. Not just the spirit, not just what we say is soul. No, it's the total person. So the holistic approach is the most excellent approach because you're dealing with the total person. And so you have some people who are qualified, and all praise due to Allah. This is your field?
Not particularly, no.
Not particularly.
No,
Yeah,
it's just something.
But there are Muslims. There are Muslims who does this kind of thing, do this kind of thing. And they try to do it from a faith perspective, and from Islam. But they know also the modalities of the secular world, so they sort of put them together. If they know those things, and I'm sure you wouldn't want to go to somebody who don't know any of those things. They're just going to tell you to get the Holy Ghost. And that's what happens sometimes.
Yeah.
Right? Say, as long as you pray, you'll be okay.
So I'm saying that, like, sometimes people say the idea of exorcisms and being very careful with, that's something that I've heard happens a lot in some immigrant Muslim communities, thinking that someone who may actually be diagnosed with schizophrenia or a severe case of bipolar disorder, being told that it's not anything in your brain, that you're possessed. And that's a very dangerous dynamic. And so I think that that's why education is so important, because when we're taking a faith-based approach, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone doesn't need to seek help for a chemical imbalance that's happening in their brain. And so I think that that's something to be really mindful of, because I have seen that on social media, like people with exorcism services who are the only mental health resource for some people in some communities. And if that's your only resource, that's a very dangerous dynamic. And so I think that it's important to kind of make these other resources that we talked about, and having like the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, all of that, having those things available and people knowing about them, I think that's really important. So that we're not going to people that are underqualified. I am underqualified, just to be clear. I'm just speaking from my personal experience and some things that have helped me, have helped people that I know. And so I'd be happy to point people to the resources. And I am going to share the PowerPoint that I have and the resources that were listed at the end, and that'll probably go out as one of those like mass emails to the Masjid community.
You want to send me something? Send it to me too.
Yeah.
Being a good person, help the world and being trained maybe in social work or something like that does not qualify you. You put yourself at risk. Some people can be very dangerous when you're dealing with chemical imbalances and things like that. So just being a good person, you
Right.
want to come from a religious perspective. You can't. That does not always work.
Oh, yeah, hey, tell me about it. It's because we've had people come here with drug problems. All I got to do is make my file express, and all you need to trust science. Go and get treatment. We had one young man that came to us. I won't mention his name. You know, it's confidential. Who had a problem. He had been in prison, and he kept falling back, receding, relapsing back into the same kind of behavior. And his salat wasn't helping him. I said, no, if you make salat and go and get the appropriate treatment, then you'll help yourself. You ask Allah for guidance. We are not opposed to science. If you go back and study the history of Muslims, we were people who pioneered science. So we're not opposed to that. We're not opposed to education. We're not opposed. We know that when we trust science, you still trust in our religion. I can give a whole talk on science and not break from the disciplines of Islam. And all of that can be backed up by the Quran. So you don't have no dark age religion unless you give your mind to some dark age people who would take you back then. Yes, ma'am. Muti is like that. Yes, ma'am. He's excellent. Muti's he's the imam of the brother who married Sister Khadija in Baltimore. Very good. The court always in Baltimore. He recommend people to go see him, especially some Muslims who has a lot of problem adjusting. Muslim doctors had a lot of problem dealing with female patients. And they do things, some of them, not all of them, but some of them do things that's inappropriate, end up in trouble, and they are sent to him, and he can work with them. Okay? Different culture, I guess culture shock. You know, so y'all understand that, culture shock. You know, someone who don't come into contact with women that much, and all of a sudden they're in a situation where they got to be a doctor for a woman. I still say that a woman is the best doctor for a woman. That's me. Okay? All right, thank you very much. Oh, come on. Oh, please, we can't hear. My wife would tell you, I don't hear as well as I used to.
It will be. Yeah.
It's going to be on YouTube. We got it right on YouTube.
I don't know when it stopped or if it has.
No, it didn't stop.
Yeah, I should.
Well, I should have brought it to you. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
I'm sorry. Here, you sit.
No, I don't need to. I'm up already. Assalamu alaikum. I would just like to announce about services. I think this is our 6th annual Interfaith Tea. It's scheduled for April 27th at 2 p.m. here at the Masjid. And inshallah, we have an RSVP, but I don't have that available with me now. We'll get it to you. But inshallah, if you plan to come, please RSVP your attendance. And also we have these little buttons that we're selling to offset the cost of the tea. It's $1, and it has our theme on it. I am my sister's keeper, speaking. It's supposed to be our truths, but I accidentally put mighty truths, but it's a mighty truth that we're speaking, inshallah. Thank you.
That's it. Anybody ever had an announcement? It's Baldwin.
The National Muslim Business Conference is May 3rd through the 5th. It's going to be in Raleigh, Durham, and they are sponsoring youth to participate. So I sent out an email. The email has already been out, so you can just check your emails for that information. Assalamu alaikum.
They do a good job. You know, so I advise all of us, well, I recommend that all of us go to that business conference. It has improved. Very good. You know, so inshallah, I think it would be beneficial for all of us to try to go. Okay? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين